It's going to take a global movement to deal with it. And what we see is a global movement emerging. I mean, there have been elements of it that have been working for a long time. You have things like groups like the landless peasant movement in Brazil, fantastic movement. You have the Chilean students who have been militating along these lines now for some 4 or 5 years. Let's give a shout for the Chilean students. Hey, go for it, guys, go for it, go for it. We have a Maoist insurrection in central India, which is portrayed as a very cruel and horrible kind of thing, but it turns out if you read Arundhati Roy or something like that, these are people who are really struggling just to stay alive in the circumstances where they're constantly being attacked by political power, by the police power of the state apparatus. And the same would be true in countries like Bolivia, where you see kind of indigenous populations mobilized, and they're mobilized in very, very strong kinds of ways. So all around the world there is a growing sense that this system, which is being constructed, does not and cannot work. And furthermore, it must not be allowed to work any further. Yeah. And there is, to me anyway, one of the big final problems, which is that capital is always about growth. You see the newspapers, and what do they say? They say, oh, there's a crisis. We have no growth. And people only stop talking about crisis when we get 3% growth, minimum. Which means that this form of society we live in is actually given over to compound growth forever. 3% compound growth forever. Now think about that for a moment. 3% compound growth on all the resources that we consume. 3% compound growth on all of the money which we accumulate. You know, when capital was about what was happening in Manchester and Birmingham and that kind of thing in, say, 1820, 3% compound growth for a long time looked okay. I mean, there was all these areas of the world that hadn't been conquered by capital yet, you know, Asia, China in particular. There was plenty of places to go. But where does the 3% compound growth come from now? The whole world is saturated. It's saturated with consumer goods, it's saturated with that growth. And what has to happen is we have to start to think about the move towards a zero growth economy. And as we think about that, we have to understand very clearly that that is a non-capitalist economy. And it's a non-capitalist economy for a very simple reason, that capital is about accumulation. It's about growth. And what we're moving to right now is a situation of low growth but continuous capital accumulation by that small group that controls most of the resources. And so 3% compound growth is going on for them. And their rates of remuneration continue to rise. I mean, I thought it was obscene and wrote, you know, violently about it back in 2003. When the leading hedge fund managers around New York City in 1 year received $250 million of personal compensation just for themselves. I thought that was grossly, absolutely unethical. And then in the middle of the crisis, just 2 years ago, the top 5 hedge fund owners in New York received in personal remuneration $3 billion each in 1 year. Now what my students say to me is, how do you become one of those? And I say, well, you know, you can go try, but they've got it all locked up. There's no way you're going to get in. So the only way you can really get a piece of that action is to make sure you reclaim it back. Now when you look at the structure and you say, look at the bonuses, the billions of bonuses.
so we didn't know he was speaking. So it was really great when he told us. My friend and I got the time to go through what's in the get across the river because the armistice march is like, so I said to him, it's fine at 5 and I can go. So we're like, oh, well, go with you then, wait down.
Being that the human mind.
The human mind.
This is my stuff, yeah? Yes, it's good.
There we go, there we go. Yeah, bonuses. You know, the thing that struck me about that is the very year they were receiving something like, you know, on Wall Street they were getting something like $40 billion in bonuses in 1 year. In that very same year, about 2 million people lost their houses to foreclosure. And what that meant was that actually there was a transfer of wealth going on because all of those houses, many of which were illegally foreclosed, were actually then that wealth was flowing off into the coffers of the bankers. This is what I mean by predatory practices. This is what I mean by stealing. The capitalist class doesn't actually work much anymore. It simply uses the financial system to steal. Now, one of the things that then occurs to me, and I think this is significant, is to start to think about how to organize political movements that actually have a big impact. And I want to give you just a couple of examples in recent years of political movements that had a big impact on the short term, but have actually, I think, some long-term lessons to teach us. One movement I'll mention first is the immigrant rights movement of 2006 in the United States. There was, at that time, a proposal to criminalize all illegal aliens. Now, this is a very terrible thing to propose. And what happened was that the response was that immigrant workers, many of them illegal, decided they were not going to go to work. And when they decided that collectively, suddenly what we saw was cities stopped. Los Angeles closed down. Chicago closed down. New York almost closed down. San Francisco almost closed down. And many other places, you know, a lot of companies seeing what was happening, particularly those employing illegal workers, just decided they weren't going to open their doors anyway. There was no point. Now what this showed was a tremendous show of force, a tremendous show of force. And we can close whole cities down. And actually when you start to look at it, you see that in closing the city down, you can actually stop capital accumulation. We saw an unfortunate example of that in the wake of 9/11 in New York City. The city was shut down. You couldn't pass through the bridges. You couldn't, you know, use the tunnels. You couldn't move. And that went on for about 2 or 3 days. And then all of a sudden, people realized if this went on for much longer, this was the end of capitalism. So the mayor came on and said, for God's sakes, get out your credit cards and start shopping. For God's sakes, get into the restaurants and go to the Broadway shows and just go back, you know, and, you know, enjoy the situation. So what you need, what is clear is that if you stop the movement of capital, and it's very easy to do, cities are very vulnerable. The food chain into New York City, or the food chain into many, if you disrupt that, then this is a major catastrophe. And there's a tremendous amount of political power. So one of the things that we have to think about is how to organize political actions in the city that actually have an impact upon how the city works. And as you do that, you start to kind of use that as a threat, because we need to mobilize in such a way that we can genuinely threaten major commercial and financial interests. And one of the other examples I would mention would be a city like Cochabamba in Bolivia, or El Alto in Bolivia. I mean, El Alto, essentially a city, in a way the whole city went on strike, and it brought down 2 presidents. And because it brought down 2 presidents, it meant that Evo Morales could get elected. So yes, indeed, bring down David Cameron. How are you going to do that? But there's a problem with that, which is you would like to think if you bring down David Cameron, there would be somebody on the other side who would do what you want to see done, but there's not. So what we need to do is to start to build a political force that actually forces somebody on the other side to do what you are asking for, which is move away from this gross inequality of wealth, take care of the environmental dilemmas, and take care of that, and actually do something radically different to end Thatcherism. That is what we have to do, and clean it out, clean it out. Start all over again. Start all over again. And how do we do that? Well, you have to start from the bottom up, and this is again something that's very, very significant here. That this movement is not guided by some ideology from the top down. It's guided from the bottom up, and that is crucial. Because until we know how to create democracy at the local level and then build that democracy into configurations that remain democratic right to the top, then we are not going to be able to implement a program. We will see good ideas co-opted by capital. And that is one of the most serious difficulties of any political movement. You come up with good ideas and then they co-opt them for their own purposes. No. But just going back to the immigrant rights movement, the interesting thing about it was the way it got demobilized was by actually dividing the immigrants from other low-paid workers. And in particular, it pointed to the immigrants who were mainly Hispanics, and then the right wing had this enormous propaganda campaign in which it said, basically, unemployment in the African American community is due to Latin American immigration. It divided. It divided. And because it divided, it ruled. So one of the things it seems to me is terrific about these assemblies is that it seems to me there is a spirit that says, even though we're very different, we have different ideas, we will not be divided. Furthermore, not only will we not be divided, but we will not be diverted. Because the way in which they operate is generally to create some sort of argument that kind of says, well, you're really talking about the wrong thing. Why don't you worry about this over here instead of really worrying about that over there? In other words, there's tremendous attempts in the media and elsewhere to divert you from what it is you want to do. Tremendous attempts will be fostered to divide you. And it'll be hard sometimes. I mean, I've been in political movements where it's hard not to be divided. And it's hard not, to stick with your own position at the same time compromise with others who have very different positions. These are not easy things to do. But if you set yourself the rule, I will not be diverted, we will not be divided, then it seems to me you have a long way to go, and in fact you're going to have a terrific impact upon the political climate in this country. So these, it seems to me, are some of the issues that